Welcome. Today we are talking about Peter Abelard, who's really a great philosopher and an odd human being. He loved to ask questions. He loved to pull on threads and just say, "Hey, where are we going with this?" Um, he's gonna make mistakes that way too in his own personal life with his associations. He makes a lot of enemies. He's kind of a pompous jerk, but he's a fun pompous jerk. So we kind of look at this a little bit differently. There's dozens of books written about him and his life and his philosophy, and this also included his famed romance with Heloise and all of the discussions about that. Really, as far as just the sort of philosophers that we would talk about, and when I watch a mini series about their life and their philosophy, Abelard's really high on that list. He's a soap opera star as much as he is a philosopher. And so that kind of makes him a little fun, right? You can kind of, depending on how you want to read his life, go in so many different avenues. His philosophy is also very important. And so we're going to learn a lot from him, and we're going to learn a lot of just kind of fun things about life, ourself maybe next to philosophy and along these lines. So sit back, buckle up, and enjoy a very brief, truncated version about who Abelard is in ways that we could spend days and weeks about instead of just, part of a class period. But that's what we're doing today. Schizo te ipsum, know thyself. It's the title of one of Abelard's works, and it's the opportunity he has here for us to decide who he is. He's trying to let us know his side of the story. Because we have to pick a side with Abelard. We don't actually have to. But everyone during his lifetime kind of had to pick a side. You're either with Abelard or with Bernard, usually, and against him. Abelard is either Christ's philosopher, the French Socrates, the Western Plato, our Aristotle, spoken of by the French, the example of the Cluny monasteries, or he's the arch heretic and leader of an international conspiracy against the church and against the Cistercians of Clairvaux. And we kind of have this one side or the other. We really kind of have to say, where are we going to go with this? And Abelard, in many ways, kind of forces us to decide. We might not like him. We might even think that he's a little bit too much, or it might be a little grandiose to refer to him as the French Socrates. But maybe he is. Maybe we need to go that way. Maybe that's the right tact for us to understand with him. Really, while we might need to pick a side with Abelard, many of us will probably also follow another one of his works, Sic et non, yes and no. He really is all of those things. Really depends on who you're looking at and how you're doing to that. During the time of Abelard, we have a battle to reform monastic life in France. Burgundy and most of the provinces might not have been technically France at this time, but they were France. Right, and we have the whole Benedictine notions of reform, and who's best? Which form shall we take? Do we want to like Cluny or Clairvaux? Each had their giant leaders. We have Abelard on one side and Bernard on the other. And the philosophies and thoughts go back and forth. And you can decide, I kind of like this and I kind of like that. This part I think is way better with Abelard, and this part's way better with Bernard. But that's kind of the way that his works are. There's a lot of yes and no. You're forced to take a side during his lifetime because, again, he's either the French Socrates or an arch heretic who's got an international conspiracy against the church. And so you gotta pick. But really, when you look at his life, there's a lot of well, here I see a little bit of that side, and here I see a little bit of that side, and yes and no. I'm gonna kind of straddle the fence, and I don't really like these things about you, Abelard, but I really admire these things about you. And so you're kind of stuck in the middle, even though you have to try to pick. And ultimately, especially during those who lived during and immediately after the time of Abelard, you kind of had to pick and decide how you're going to hedge your bets and what is the right way to go. The exciting thing is that Abelard was on everyone's mind during his lifetime. He really was the most famous man on earth during his lifetime. There's probably very few people who, in the late 11th century, beginning of the 12th century, had as much people talking about him in so many different countries and areas as he was. And his debates and his fights and his struggles were just everywhere. And everyone had to decide, do we like you or not? It's tantalizing, right? He's a superstar as a scholastic philosopher. And again, his sort of romantic interludes with Heloise is part of all of that, right? Because he's got this sort of scandalous life, and amongst everything else. Heloise, in a letter to Abelard, once wrote, "What king or philosopher could equal your fame? What kingdom or city or village did not long to see you? Who did not rush to set eyes on you when you appeared in public and crane their necks after you? What married women, what young girl did not desire you in absence, or was not on fire in your presence? What queen had great and powerful lady did not envy me, Heloise, my or her joys and her bed," right? This is the sort of like scandal that you don't get out of most philosophers. This is the sort of intrigue that you just look at and you go, this is just different. There's something fun about Abelard, even though there's a lot that's not. And right, it's not just a random little like, oh, did you hear what Diogenes did sort of thing. Or, oh yeah, you were really good at this, and look at the scandal. I mean, this is gossipy scandal. This is stuff that people are like, ooh, this is kind of neat and good, and not just like, oh, he's a creep, sort of thing. That there's intrigue, and he's got enough sympathy that you give him that goes along and kind of doesn't seem to fit with how pompous and arrogant he might be in another moment, but everyone kind of knew and thought about him and discussed him in ways that we didn't really get anytime before the 12th century, and rarely do we get amongst philosophers after that. His works, he's got 5 major works that people will talk about: the History Calamitium, the history of his own life, Sicto te ipsum know thyself, which we've mentioned before. There's work Abelard and Heloise, his work called his Theology, and Sic et non, yes and no. Abelard was born in 1079 to a landholding knight named Berenger. Now, if you're actually familiar with a larger history of philosophy, you might know that Lanfranc, who taught Anselm, was once debated with a man by the name of Berenger over the whole issue of dialectic and its point, and Lanfranc emerged victorious. While it might be fun to think of this as the same person, it's not. So throw that out there. His mother's name was Lucia, and he grew up in a village of Palais near Nantes. He was brilliant, yet completely egotistical. He's one of those guys who was probably always the smartest person in any room he walked in, but didn't know how to walk into a room, possibly, in the right sort of way. Didn't follow the sort of conventions that he should in society. Critics also said that he was quite stupid at anything that wasn't academic. Otto of Friesling once wrote that he was so arrogant and confident in his own genius that he could scarcely descend from the heights of his exalted mind to listen to his masters. And his thought is like, yeah, whatever. I don't care, right? That's your opinion. I'm right. You're wrong. I don't care. I'm not going to listen to you, even though you kind of deserve that I listen to you. You're a master in this field, and I'm just studying. I'm just learning, but I'm gonna do it. And right, and this is why his life is a life of calamities. Right? This is why he writes the Historia Collatium, because you got to pick a side, right? You got to know what you're doing. You got to figure out what life is going to be for you. And he wants to try to make sure you side on his side, even though there's a lot of people out there who don't like him and don't like his ideas so much. At the beginning of the 12th century, really right at the beginning, like the year 1100, there's this kind of brief explosion of a philosophical concept that most philosophers at that time decided we need to stop everything and address this one question. And this is the question of universals. How much of our mental understanding of a thing indicates that there's a substance or a form behind it? How much of it us thinking about a thing means that there's a thing behind that thing? Is there a realm of ideas or something else that's there? Before 1100, this wasn't really much of a question. Different people had answers and kind of addressed this issue, but it wasn't this hot debate that it was right at the beginning of the 12th century. Really, there's questions of how do we group things together? Is there a universal concept of tree? When I say tree, is there something we all share in common? Are we all, even if we're not thinking of the same tree or might even argue about whether or not an item is a tree, is there a universal concept that we're all appealing to, that we share in common? Is there, outside of our own mental formulations, a notion of treeness? Trees are important and trees are nice, but really the question was risen not over the trees, but of man. Right? Is there a universal concept of what a man is? Or is it just your thought, my thought? And then yet, if that's the case, how can we both agree that that person is a person and not something different? What if they're a little off, a little different, a little not like everybody else around here? We'd probably still say they're a person, but have they lost this? Is there some question that can be lost? Now, the answers up until this point were really kind of found in two different ways. The first was that notion of grammar. Right? This is, for Anselm, the solution, right? That grammar implied ideas, and ideas exist apart from just the person who says it. And if the statement is true, then the idea has some sort of source for its truth, because that's what makes it true, is that it's just objectively the case. And therefore, there must be a source for this truth. So when I say Socrates is a man, that means he has a human nature. Grammar itself implies this, and we all accept that as a function of grammar, and the fact that we speak these words means that there is truth behind them. And this was a solution for many. Others would look at notions of logic. Logic indicates that Socrates is an individual, one of many that we would call man, an individual who shares common qualities that we identify as human nature. But if he shares all of this, what does he have that belongs to him, and what does he have that belongs to this shared human nature? A couple of debates over all of this, and the sort of solution by many was that Socrates has a right to his name and his individual identity, but he also shares that identity with his nature to this universal concept of man. But what do we say then? What can we say not about Socrates, the name, or the individual characteristics, but what can we say about man or human nature? Where are they? How do we find them? Where's their source? How is it we can analyze it? What can we say that tells us this is a man and not a tree? Both have limbs, both grow upright, but yet how do we look at this and address them? The general thought was that where is human nature? Where is treeness? Where are these to be found? That they don't appear to us other than in our mental formulations, right? That they're not a part. I can't just carve out part of a tree and say this is the essence of a tree, or carve out a part of a person and say this is that human nature. But rather that we might invent these terms for the purpose of speech and understanding. Yet then that brings us back to that whole grammar case of, if it's true, then this idea has a source in its truth somewhere. There's some objective idea. So we're always kind of left with that whole question of what is the relationship between the nature and the person. Now, again, this is not a new debate. It just kind of caught on fire here at this time, right? This debate goes back to Plato and Anselm, who largely followed along with him, right? When Plato talked about the ideas with the forms or the ideas in one realm, right? This is that same sort of thing. This is that same debate, that same discussion. Aristotle and later on Aquinas will kind of address this issue by talking about substance and essence, and will largely take this approach. The concepts are less real than the objects, but there is some sort of idea still within these concepts, and yet how does that work? And how are we supposed to understand where those come from? So this is the debate that's raging on right at the time that we have a young Abelard, early 20s, decides he's going to make his sort of entry into the whole realm of philosophy. And instead of just being a student on this issue, he's going to try to find the answer to this giant question that goes back to Plato and Aristotle and possibly even before all of that, and trying to address where are universals to be found? And how should we look and think about the concept of universals? Is there a universal or not? To be fair to Abelard, it's not as if he just decided, while sitting in some sort of alley in Paris to decide, I'm going to resolve this old dispute that existed between Aristotle and Plato and who knows forever before all of that. But he was engaged with thoughts of others. Really, he was engaged with a person by the name of William of Champeaux, who was 9 years older than Abelard, born in 1070. And Champeaux is the founder of the school at St. Victor, which is very important for the trajectory of philosophy. Even Abelard is somewhat connected with this sort of school and a student of Champeaux and learning from him, and therefore really he should be championing the ideas of Champeaux. He doesn't. He fights against him. But Champeaux really kind of proposed this extreme realism, that there is this real idea of man and real idea of treeness, and that's how it needs to be understood. That the nature of a being was essentially wholly present at one and the same time in every individual, right? That this being, that you possess all of what it means to be a man, that tree possesses all of this idea of what it means to be a tree. In other words, tree exists in every tree, and humanity exists in every person. That universals are everywhere and therefore in everything. Abelard, so this is an extreme idea, and he pushes back against Champeaux. He says that this leaves no room for individual distinctions. Right? There's no Socrates in this case. There's only man. That there's no Champeaux, there's no Abelard, there's just man. That we've lost all individuality if we're going to assume total universality. So what are you going to do with that, Champeaux? This actually forced Champeaux to modify, and he added an indefinitor in a similar fashion, so that way each individual has the same status as the whole, though not containing the entire whole. So he kind of sidesteps this issue. It says, well, you possess all of this, but you don't contain all of that. That you have the status of the whole, but you don't contain the whole. And this is Champeau's response. Abelard says this is not far enough. Abelard states very clearly that it is impossible to predicate a thing about a thing. Only a name, not a thing, can be applied to a group. He proposed that universal is a vocal sound, vox, V-O-X, right? He then changed it later to a mental word, sermo, S-E-R-M-O, right? There's this mental representation, he says, is more indistinct than the thing in itself. But it works to represent the nature of a thing. So it's not just sound waves, it becomes this mental idea, right? And that it represents the nature of this, that we don't know the thing by looking at this thing, but we have this mental formulation about that it goes back to our mind. And now we notice right here in the year 1100, some of those debates that we're getting later on with Hume and Descartes and Kant and Hegel, and where are the things mixed in with this, right? All of the philosophy of the early modern period seems to be kind of recycling the same debate that we have here with Abelard in the Middle Ages. Abelard states that the mind is what makes connections between certain things to classify and group them together. This should sound very familiar, as we have this same argument made in the early modern period. We have this same sort of foundational idea being essential to the philosophy of Kant and Hegel, and how we're going to construct ideas about things, right? The mind is what makes these connections between certain things to classify and group them. Notice just here the categories, right? Together. It is a function of the mind, and there's not a universal concept, is what Abelard ends up saying. That there is no real universals. What we have is a mind that is able to make categories about things. Again, this is groundbreaking in the year 1100, because it's still debated in the 18th and 19th centuries, right? This is kind of like, yeah, I solved this, 700 years before you even were born, sort of thing, right? Abelard says there's no real discussion that we should apply to metaphysics in all of this, that it's just the sort of mental formulations, that there's not this universal idea of universals. Now, of course, Abelard's brilliance is good, but it's not left there, because others will also want to weigh in, including Abelard's chief opponent, that of Bernard. Bernard says that there are three kinds of being that exists apart from God, and this becomes his sort of entryway into this discussion of universals. That we have eternal ideas or forms of all created being. Right? These are present to the mind of God from all of eternity, and that they have no contact with the material universe, right? That there's this idea of something that God knows about, but we don't necessarily have this, forms attached to that. That there are created ideas, and that these are based on eternal ideas. These are perishable as they are also material. And finally, for Bernard, we have formless matter. They are created at creation and remain unchanged amid the flux of different sensible things. They have a universal mode of existence. They are known to the mind in their own form. The idea leads to the question about the form of God, obviously, because does God then have a form, right? Is there a form of God like other forms in and around the object itself? As such, continuing with this idea, have we produced some sort of pantheistic universe is kind of a question that gets asked about by Bernard here, and one of his followers, a guy by the name of Brother Thethery. And then this ends up creating what becomes known as the pantheism of Chartres, which is its own giant other large debate, which Bernard does not formally in any sort of way wouldn't say, especially being a pantheistic, is later on he will be canonized a saint by the Catholic Church. We would have to just state that he isn't a pantheist, but that becomes part of that question that might exist, and is also something that we see, Hume debating on his dialogues about natural religion. That same sort of idea that this door has been opened to, if there's a form of God, where do we get that? Or how do we see it? Is God just the spirit of the world? Sort of questions. Another person who jumped into this debate is somebody by the name of Gilbert de la Poirier. And Gilbert was another disciple of Bernard's. He addresses Boethius's distinction between substance and subsistence. Boethius kind of makes this sort of division of the substance of a thing and the subsistence of the thing. Later on, we generally might think of this more under Aquinas' ideas of essence and existence, but Boethius used the term substance and subsistence, and there is a distinction and a difference which we can get to at another time. But universals are substances, but not existing substances, right? Substances, it's a fun word, right? Substances play a part of the forms to the substances, and this identifies the universal abstract concepts, which is but does not subsist from any particular thing, which are both are and subsist. So we have this weird connection of the ideas of that ideas behind it, and those things that kind of exist as a result of that. So there are different debates all surrounding this idea of universals. For Abelard, his answer is just very simple, that it's impossible to predicate a thing about a thing, that you can't look upon an individual tree and say that there is treeness from that, even though grammatically there might be a concept of truth, or that God might have knowledge of this, or even hold that there is an idea of truth, that it's all simply mental formulations, and this is where we get any idea of universals. It's just the way your mind works. Around 1132, roughly 30 years after that giant debate that he's got over the issues of universals, Abelard thinks that he needs to write an autobiography. Now, this is a very odd thing to do. Usually autobiographies were done out of some sort of spiritual autobiography. Usually it was monks who are addressing the sins that they have in their life. It's not a tell-all biography of, oh, you'd find out what I did here, there, and everywhere. I mean, we've encountered this idea with Augustine in his Confessions, right? Look at the sin, look at my miserableness, look at the theft of the pears, etc. This is not what Abelard is doing. In 1132, Abelard says, I need to set the story straight. I need future readers to know who I was. And they need to understand that I'm not a heretic or a traitor, both accusations that were made out of him. He wants everyone to see his side of the story, both as a great lover and a great hater of people and the events. And again, he does get condemned a handful of times. He's forgiven for all of his condemnations before he dies, usually shortly thereafter, although there will be people who undoubtedly hold some level of animosity at him his entire life, and maybe even theirs after he dies. His condemnations were largely because of the way that he did his philosophy, the way that he wrote, the way that he thought. Right, in his work, Sic et Non, Yes and No, he asks a lot of questions. He points out some controversial things, and he just kind of throws a question out there. And he doesn't give the answer, which is something that other philosophers, like Lombard later on, will definitely pick up on that and say, we need to give the answers, otherwise we too might face charges of being a heretic or a traitor. For Abelard, this was just all a style of his rhetoric. He wanted to ask questions. He wanted to throw a question out there and say, think about it. Now, his answer is, if you're coming up with a heretical answer, if you're coming up with a treasonous answer, that's because you're dumb. Like that's just because you don't understand things the way that they actually are. Remember, I'm way smarter than you. This is his stance. This is the way that he thinks about and looks at everything. That he's got the answers, and therefore he doesn't necessarily need to give it to you. You should be happy that he gave you enough questions to get to the right answers. And therefore you've proven it yourself instead of just doing what he says. Again, there's some value in this. But again, there's danger in that as well. I mean, it's much better if we just do it Socratically, that I ask you a question and you produce your own answers. But if the answers you produce are the wrong ones, then does that mean I'm a bad teacher? Does that mean that it's my fault? Abelard says, no, I'm not the traitor. I'm not the heretic. You might be. And you need to look at your life in a different sort of way. And I need to set the story straight. I need everyone to at least in this work, in the history of my calamities, to see that I'm not a heretic, to see that I'm not a traitor, that I'm right, and that I was right to do things the way that I did. And he, is a bit of a jerk, and so he needs to, set this story straight to make sure that not everyone hates him, right? I mean, his thought was that we're all lucky just to be in the glow of his brilliance. He might have actually been right. Again, understanding his philosophy and his life a little bit more, he may have been right about a lot of this, but he's still kind of got a lot of enemies because he still is kind of a jerk. So many enemies that the year before he started writing this, in 1131, he went to Gildas to see the Pope consecrate the altar of the abbey. And while he was there, a group of monks grabbed him and tried to kill him. I mean, if a bunch of monks are trying to kill you, you might have gone a little bit too far with some things and kind of advanced ideas, maybe farther than what you even intended to. Or maybe you're just that much of a jerk that, you need to at least say, I'm sorry, I'm such a jerk. But for Abelard, this is all just perfectly okay. It's reasonable. Not that he's getting killed, but everything that he's done. In his theology, which he wrote in 1103, he connects the notion of theology with the idea of the logos, right? And if Christ is the logos, then Christians are logicians. If Christ is equator, I mean, this is basic grammar, right? And therefore, everything needs to follow logically. And therefore, the true Christian is the logician, is the person who's doing logic games. That his work, the theology, is a reconciliation of human reason with revelation. And again, he doesn't answer all of the questions that he poses, which is going to get him into trouble. But he says, no, it's just logical. And that this is the way that we should all move and proceed. One of the most scandalous things that Abelard was a part of had nothing to do with his debate over universals or him just being a jerk and expecting that we're all happy to be in the glow of his brilliance, but is the long romance that he has with Heloise. Abelard was hired on by Heloise's uncle, a man by the name of Fulbert, to be her tutor. Now, Heloise is known for being probably the most learned lady in all of France, even before Abelard showed up. She is a brilliant woman, and if she found herself in a different cultural milieu, we would probably be talking about her and her contribution to philosophy as much as we are Abelard's. But as it was, Abelard was hired to teach Heloise. He's in his mid-30s at this point. She's 10 to 20 years younger than he is, probably late teens, hopefully late teens, depending on the accounts of the stories, right? She's considerably younger, but well matured enough and wise enough that everyone recognizes her brilliance even before he showed up. The two fairly quickly fall in love, and before too long, she got pregnant. He then kind of tries to do the right thing, maybe.
He abducts her. The two run off, go back to his home in Brittany, and she gives birth to a son. They get married, and then Abelard arranges for her to enter into a convent. Problem is if you're married, the general rules at the time is that you can't be a philosophy instructor. You can't become a master and teach others. And so he can't be married. But he's going to give her and maintain her honor by being married, and then she goes off into a convent. And largely it seems that she's pretty happy with this arrangement as well. Who's not happy with it, though, is her family. Fulbert and everyone else believes that this repudiates the marriage. And Heloise also, to kind of enter the convent in some ways, kind of denies some of this. But entering into a convent was in many ways kind of like divorcing her. Even though that wasn't a divorce, it practically kind of was. He's allowed to get married. He's not a monk at this time. He's not a priest. There's no rules that he couldn't get married. But this is going to ruin his possibility of teaching. And again, everyone just needs to be around him and his brilliance, and he needs to teach, and family kind of needs to come second. So being married is going to cause its own issues. Being married but not appearing so also kind of preserves this career option and seems like a good middle ground for Abelard and Heloise. But not the Fulberts, right? Not the rest of the family. Everyone else doesn't seem this very good. And once when Abelard is in Notre Dame Cathedral, the family abducts him and castrates him for this crime against the family. Again, he's had a very interesting life, and stories can be told, right? And again, miniseries. This seems like perfect material, right? You get the brilliance, you get the philosophy, you get the scandals, you get the romance and the intrigue. You get him getting castrated, which shortly thereafter he says that he needs to become a monk. He's castrated anyway, so he becomes a monk. And he becomes much more serious about all of life. He's still egotistical, but he kind of doesn't just throw attacks as people as he did earlier on in his life. He still kind of does, but he doesn't, he's a more serious person. It's also at this point that he becomes known by the name of Abelard and not Peter. He says that Peter is a masculine name, and well, since he's castrated, he needs another name, and this is where we get the name Abelard and where that comes from. He also enters into more fights with Bernard at this point, because Bernard thought that Abelard reduced faith to only the idea of an opinion and advanced some sort of idea of ethical relativism. Abelard rejects this idea very clearly. He wrote, "I will never be a philosopher if it is to speak against St. Paul. I would not be an Aristotle if this was to separate me from Christ. I have set my building on the cornerstone on which Christ has built his church. If the tempest rises, I am not shaken. If the wind rave, I am not fearful. I rest upon the rock that cannot be moved," right? So this is his stance of being a philosopher, is very consistent with being a Christian. And in fact, being a Christian for Abelard is more important. He might need a couple more lessons in humility and love and all this other stuff, but this is his argument. But he still is a philosopher. He also wrote at one point that he thought that he was the only philosopher in all of the world, that this is who he was. And so this becomes his idea of what philosophy should be. And that we need to stop and we need to think and we need to recollect, and that this is logical and there's a solution to all of the problems that we have, even if they're hard to see and understand that this is the case. Essential for Abelard and how he'd want to understand himself and everything else is about intention. Your intentionality decides if something is right or wrong. Abelard wouldn't have ever said that he intended on being a jerk, that he just kind of was kind of a jerk, right? This wasn't his intention. His intention wasn't to bring shame to Heloise, that he loved and cared for her. His intention, though, was also not to necessarily be married, as he wanted to become a teacher, and there was challenges with all that. His intention by asking questions was to lead you to the truth, to understand the way things were, and not to go too far and end up being heretical or questions. All of this should have been logical and laid itself out very clearly. This applies to the whole realm of morality as much as anything else. For Abelard, a deed is good because of a good intention. Goodness is found in the intention of the will. What is it that you're willing to do? What is it your will puts itself for? He states that it doesn't seem that a plurality of goodness or good things can be found in act plus intention. A deed is good because of good intention. That the intention is what's going to decide if something is good. We say, in fact, that an intention is good, that is right in itself, but that an action is good, not because it acquires any kind of goodness in itself, but because it comes from this good intention. Once again, we can see a very clear line between Abelard and Kant. Right? Kant's categorical imperative and this whole notion of deontology follows very close to this idea of what's your intention? Are you intending to do a good thing or not? Now, he doesn't set up a categorical imperative, but it's this whole idea of what is your personal intention. And for some, this looks a little bit like everything is relative with regards to morality. But this is the argument that's being made by Abelard here, right? Because it's what was the intention. He says, because of a difference of intention, and thus its relation to good and evil, this idea seems to be altered. Sometimes a good thing, if the intention is bad, and sometimes the other way around. Goodness, he says, is to be found in the intention of the will. The problem is not in the actual transgression of the law, but the treatment of the lawgiver. So now we have this sort of question being proposed that is very scandalous for everyone around the time of Abelard, but is important. What was worse, crucifying Christ or eating the fruit in the garden? Now, obviously, the first thought is crucifying Christ is evil beyond anything else for that audience of Abelard's, right? Here you're taking God and you're killing him. But what was the intention? Was the intention in crucifying Christ? They're upholding the law and serving God as well as they thought, right? There might have been some who had hard-hearted, but right, the thought was by the people executing Christ that they're doing this out of love of God, even though their love might be misplaced. Again, there would be discussions around all this, but if their intention was to serve God, then is it bad, even though what you're doing was bad? The consequence was. Adam and Eve directly disregarded God's commandments. Their sin wasn't in the eating of the fruit, but was in the intention. They intended on disobeying God. Right? He states that the law itself doesn't state the ethical good, but it's the intention that's going to be in relation to this. Also, he points out that some goods are not intrinsic if the will is not there. If you don't have a will towards a goodness, are you being good, right? Your intention matters for Abelard. And this is somewhat scandalous because he does open the door for a little bit of ethical relativity because it's your approach to the event. Now, Aquinas will talk about intention as well, and this is a debate that exists and lingers, but this is a big sort of just bomb chucked out there by Abelard with his philosophy, right? The idea that Adam and Eve could be worse off than those who crucified Christ, the eating of fruit as opposed to the murdering of God, Well, what was the intention? And do we need to look at things differently because of the intention? Is there a difference in moral weight? And so should we also look at Abelard a little different, because while he might have done a lot of things, his intention wasn't always to be such a bad guy. Maybe. Right? He wasn't trying to be a pompous, arrogant jerk. He just kind of was. Right? He wasn't trying to run around a little bit too much with a student. He just kind of did. Right? It was done out of love. It wasn't done out of lust. It wasn't done out of, what he can gather and take. Right? This becomes the questions and the challenges that he's asking. Intentionality is all fine and good, but Abelard also made a lot of enemies, and these enemies will end up, going out against him. Abelard was condemned a subsequent time as a heretic. He had one count before this, but in 1140 he's condemned at the Synod of Sens, mainly because of the confrontation, the enemies he has, regardless of his intentions, with Bernard, generally later on referred to as Saint Bernard, right? Bernard is described by most onlookers as very religious and learned and very pious. He becomes the architect for the miserable crusades that we don't want to necessarily talk about one of them. And it failed miserably, and he wasn't very good at all that. But, right, Bernard is called to do so because of his piety and what was seen as his love for God. Abelard, right, he's kind of a little bit arrogant. Bernard will end up calling Abelard the most stupid instead of the most learned. He'll take his work theology, and instead of calling it his theology, he calls it his studiology, which is a fancy way of calling it stupidology, just in Latin, right? And so Bernard will look over all of Abelard's works, and he ends up writing up a 19-page list of all of the heresies that he thinks he sees in Abelard's writings. And this is discussed at the Synod of Sens, and it doesn't go very well for Bernard, actually, at all. Abelard has this weird moment of humility. And Bernard, who's seen generally as kind of humble and pious, gets a little too haughty and reads out every charge against him and tries to do this big show trial. And it doesn't really look good to anyone who's there for Bernard, and it looks pretty good for Abelard. Abelard actually walks out of it. 6 weeks later, he'll, be condemned by the Pope and excommunicated. But Abelard's followers, said that he, was not leading some sort of international conspiracy against the church, that he was just piously trying to be a philosopher and a good Christian, that he wanted to be a logician because this is what he saw being the realm of philosophy. This actually did gain him a lot of supporters as well, and it really lessened the severity of the punishment. He was condemned as a heretic and to perpetual silence, but he wasn't ever executed. Rather, he lives the rest of his life under house arrest in Cluny, a monastery, with the help of a man by the name of Peter the Venerable. He remains a good monk the last few years of his life. He may or may not have written anything, but he somewhat still kept this idea of perpetual silence, and he used this time maybe to clean up or modify some of his other works to make sure that there were answers that were given. Before he died, Pope Innocent II will lift the condemnation against Abelard. We don't have a clear record of exactly what happened, but the monastery gets destroyed later during the French Revolution. But we know that Abelard will die in full communion with the church and recanted any heretical ideas that was said that he still had at this point, and is able to be connected. So he does have this moment of humility, at least in these last few years of his life. Heloise will later on die, also as a nun, and will get buried next to Abelard, and so we end up having these two of them together, right, buried side by side. And you could visit them at their grave. There they are, right? That there's this sort of connection. So his philosophy was there, and it was controversial and yet way ahead of its time, and questions that are answered later by people like Kant are addressing these same things. But Abelard's doing it, in the 1100s, and he's staying close somewhat to the church, as close as he could. Even when he's getting condemned, there's plenty of other monastic leaders who think, no, he's right on. He's not leading an international conspiracy against the church. He's not a traitor or a heretic. He just made bad enemies. As he's continuing also throughout most of his life to criticize Champeau as well. Again, he made powerful enemies. Not a good move. But he also tried to stay good and connected within everything, and will die in full communion, which for him was essential to his understanding of the role and connection between philosophy and theology, what it means to be a thinker and what it means to be a follower of God. They were one and the same for Abelard, and this is what he concluded with. So what do we say about Abelard? Is he a true philosopher, a rationalist, a heretic, a theologian, a logician? That's what he would like to be called, maybe more than anything else. He lived his life on the edge, and he'd support his own work until they get censored, and then he'll modify them afterwards to make sure that if he stepped over the line, that he wanted to be back in the graces of the church and the graces of his community. He wasn't going to die a martyr or a heretic. He wanted to live as a true Christian theologian philosopher. He used reason. He never abandoned his faith to his reason. They were always seen as one and the same. But he was always on the edge, and he loved to ask questions and expected you to come up with the answers, even if the answers were hard. And he made a lot of bad enemies. Maybe as brilliant as he was an idiot. Maybe we have to agree with earlier, criticisms of him, that when it comes to, bookish things, to philosophy and thinking, he was brilliant. Maybe more brilliant than anyone else. But when it came to how to construct the rest of his life, maybe not. What intentions matter? How should we see Abelard? His intentions was to be a good, practicing, thinking Christian. He didn't always stay on the right side of that line. He wanted to always advance ideas, and he thought that his brilliance would shine through and everyone would just grow into that. Is that right? Is that too much? I don't know. What do we do with Abelard? What do we do with a man who asks questions but doesn't give us the answers? Do we condemn him, even though his intention is not to have us think about bad things, but rather just to know what's true? What role does intention play in morality? Do you guys agree with Abelard that it might be worse for Adam and Eve than it is for those who condemned Christ? These are good questions for you guys to think about and ponder and debate with one another. If you have any other questions, let me know.